In Washington, power usually whispers, but every so often it ends up on tape. This is the story of how Donald Trump's chief of staff, Susie Wiles, went from being one of the most powerful people you've probably never heard of to the center of a media storm involving Vanity Fair, leaked audio, accusations of fake recordings, and a very public dispute about who's telling the truth. And beneath all of that drama lies a much bigger question. What does this chaos inside Trump's inner circle mean for American politics, for the stability of his administration, and for the rest of the world that has to deal with a United States run this way? Stay with me, because this isn't just about one interview. It's about loyalty, power, and how modern political warfare is fought through headlines, leaks, and sound bites. Let's start with the key player at the heart of this saga, Susie Wiles. If you follow every twist of American politics, her name might already be familiar. If not, here's the short version. Susie Wiles is not a TV pundit, not a firebrand at rallies, and not a Twitter personality. She's an operator, a strategist, someone who has spent years pulling levers behind the scenes in Republican politics, especially in Florida. She helped build winning campaigns in a state that has become absolutely central to Republican power. She was involved in the rise of figures like Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis before ultimately breaking with DeSantis and moving decisively into Donald Trump's orbit. The time Trump mounted his comeback bid, Wiles was widely described as his most important political advisor. She helped shape his 2024 campaign strategy, oversaw key operations, and was often portrayed as the person who could say no to Trump and still keep her job, something very few people manage for long. So when Trump returned to power and chose Wiles as his chief of staff, it sent a clear signal. This time, the person running the West Wing, or at least managing the chaos around Trump, would not be a fresh face or a family member. It would be a battle-hardened operative who knew Trump, knew the movement, and knew how Washington works. That makes her role absolutely central. A chief of staff is the gatekeeper to the president, the traffic cop for information, the enforcer of priorities. In any administration, that's powerful. In Trump's world, where loyalty and access are everything, it's almost unmatched. And that's exactly why what came next exploded into such a big deal. Somewhere along the way, Vanity Fair sat down with Susie Wiles. Now, Vanity Fair is not Breitbart. It's not Fox News. It's a magazine associated with glossy profiles, behind-the-scenes political reporting, and, from the perspective of Trump's base, a media world that is generally skeptical, if not hostile, to Trumpism. So the idea that Trump's own chief of staff would speak to Vanity Fair, on the record, or at least in a way that could be quoted and recorded, was striking from the start, according to the coverage you've been seeing from the Associated Press, USA Today, New York Magazine's Intelligencer, ABC News, The Daily Beast, and others. The Vanity Fair piece painted a complicated picture of Susie Wiles and the Trump operation. The article reportedly described private conversations about Trump's decision-making, about the people being floated for top jobs in his administration, and about the inner politics of Trump world. It touched on big names like former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi and rising Republican star J.D. Vance, and on the question of who gets a seat at the table in Trump's second act. Some of the most explosive parts of that Vanity Fair package weren't just the written words. They were audio clips, short segments, call them truth bombs, as they were later labeled in the controversy, circulated online and in media coverage. In those clips, you can hear someone who sounds like Susie Wiles speaking in blunt, unscripted terms about Trump, his allies, and the internal workings of the administration. From the way other outlets described the story, these recordings came across as candid, sometimes cutting, and definitely not the kind of polished message a White House wants out in public. They seemed to show Wiles talking about Trump's temperament, his reliance on loyalty over expertise, and the jockeying inside his circle. They reportedly touched on whether certain loyalists, including Pam Bondi and others, were really qualified for the cabinet jobs and senior posts their names were attached to. For critics and skeptics of Trump, this Vanity Fair package looked like confirmation of everything they've long believed, that even inside Trump's own camp, there are deep doubts about his discipline, his judgment, and the people around him. For Trump loyalists, though, the reaction was different and immediate: betrayal, Trump's base prizes, loyalty above almost everything else. And for them to see Trump's own chief of staff apparently spilling unflattering details to a magazine like Vanity Fair was a kind of political heresy. Which brings us to Susie Wiles' response. Very quickly, Wiles and her allies began to push back. In statements and follow-up coverage, she slammed the Vanity Fair story as what one outlet summarized as a disingenuously framed hit piece. She argued that her words were selectively edited, stripped of context, and twisted into something that did not reflect what she actually believed or said. The New York Magazine piece you linked to notes that Wiles denied making certain comments about Trump and the White House that Vanity Fair attributed to her. She tried to draw a line between what she remembered saying and how the article framed it. And then there were the recordings. Those truth bombs became the center of a second, even more explosive front in this war. According to the Daily Beast headline, Wiles claimed that some of those audio clips were not authentic. She reportedly suggested that the recordings had been manipulated or faked, that the snippets circulating online and in media coverage were not genuine reflections of what she had actually said in those conversations. In other words, she implied that Vanity Fair and its sources were using doctored or misleading audio to make her look like she was trashing Trump and his inner circle. That's a serious accusation. In an era when AI-generated audio and deepfakes are real and growing problems, blaming fake or manipulated recordings has become a go-to defense for politicians caught on tape saying things they later regret. But it's also a high-risk strategy, because if you say those recordings are fake and then journalists can prove that they're not, you don't just have a messaging problem, you have a credibility crisis. And that's exactly where the Daily Beast comes in. The Daily Beast ran a story under the headline describing Wiles as being busted for lying about truth bombs being faked. In plain language, that means its reporters concluded that the recordings were real, that they matched original material, and that her claims of fakery or manipulation did not hold up. We don't need to get into every technical detail of their reporting here, but the basic picture is this. Journalists compared the clips Wiles was dismissing with source audio and other evidence. Their conclusion was that these weren't AI-fabricated deepfakes, they weren't stitched together from random words, and they weren't invented out of thin air. They were, in substance, what they appeared to be Susie Wiles on tape, saying things that she now found politically damaging. So at this point, the situation looks like this. On one side, you have Vanity Fair publishing an interview and reporting that depict Trump's chief of staff as candidly critical, or at least sharply realistic, about Trump and some of his would-be cabinet members and inner circle. On another side, you have Wiles claiming the article was a hit piece, that she was misrepresented, and that key recordings were not what they seemed. On yet another side, you have additional outlets, like the Daily Beast, essentially calling her bluff and saying, actually, the audio is real. And now you're not just dealing with a, quote, problem, you're dealing with a truth problem. Let's pause there for a second and talk about how unusual this is. Political aides and chiefs of staff give interviews all the time. They background reporters, they spin, they frame events in ways that help their boss. That's normal. What's not normal is a sitting chief of staff to one of the most polarizing and closely watched leaders on earth getting pulled into a days-long news cycle where the central question is, did she lie about lying? It's one thing for anonymous sources to trash each other in the press. It's another for the most powerful staffer in Trump's operation to be directly accused in public of making things up about whether her own recorded words are real. Inside Trump world, that's dynamite. Donald Trump's political brand is built on a constant narrative of victimizatio, and by the media, that he's always being misquoted, taken out of context, and targeted by fake news. Wiles leaned into that reflex by framing the article as an unfair attack. But Trump's personal brand is also built around a simple, harsh attitude toward staff. Once you are seen as disloyal, you redisposable. So imagine the conversation now happening behind closed doors. The person tasked with defending Trump, enforcing loyalty, and managing the message has become the story herself. Her judgment is under question. Her word is under question, and she's facing headlines that essentially say, Trump's chief of staff lied about this. Whether you support Trump or oppose him, you can see the danger in that from his perspective. There are a few possible outcomes from this kind of crisis. One is that Trump doubles down on Wiles, accepts her explanation, and treats this as yet another example of a hostile media trying to pick off his inner circle. In that scenario, Wiles survives, but probably with less room to maneuver, less perceived independence, and more pressure to prove her loyalty every single day. Another outcome is that this becomes a tipping point. Trump might decide that a chief of staff who attracts this kind of controversy and whose word publicly collides with taped evidence and outside reporting is too much of a liability. If that happens, you start hearing rumors of shakeups, replacements, and behind-the-scenes power struggles. And remember, we're not talking about some mid-level staffer. We're talking about the person who manages Trump's schedule, controls what goes in and out of the Oval Office, and often has more influence on day-to-day governing than almost anyone else. That's why this story isn't just gossip. It's structural. It's about who's actually running things. And that has consequences far beyond Washington. Let's talk about that bigger picture. To understand why this matters for global politics, you have to think about how other countries read Washington. Foreign governments, whether allies like Germany and Japan or rivals like China and Russia, follow the personalities and power plays in the American Capitol very closely. They're watching not just the president, but who surrounds him, who has his ear, who can talk him out of bad ideas, who can quietly kill a proposal or push another one forward. Susie Wiles has been seen as one of the few people around Trump who understands both his base and the broader political and institutional landscape. She knows how to win elections, but she also understands how bureaucracy, Congress, and the media work. If a figure like that looks weakened, isolated, or on her way out, it raises questions in foreign capitals. Is there a power vacuum inside the White House? Is Trump relying more heavily on hardliners who care less about institutions and more about spectacle? Are decisions going to be even more impulsive or even more tightly controlled by a smaller circle of family and ultra-loyalists? Now layer on the specific content of the Vanity Fair controversy. If Wiles is privately questioning the qualifications of people considered for top roles, whether that's Pam Bondi, J.D. Vance, or other key allies, that suggests real tension over who should be in charge of America's justice system, its foreign policy, its national security, and more. From the outside, that looks like instability. Imagine you're in Brussels trying to figure out how reliable the U.S. will be on NATO commitments. Imagine you're in Beijing calculating how serious Washington's positions are on trade, Taiwan, or technology controls. Imagine you're in Moscow deciding how much risk you're willing to take in Ukraine based on whether Washington looks united or divided. A White House that can keep its own chief of staff out of a tape and, quote, scandal with Vanity Fair, and then ends up in a fight over whether those tapes are even real, does not project discipline. And in geopolitics, perceptions of discipline and unity matter almost as much as the reality. There's also another layer to this, the technology piece. Whether you think Susie Wiles was genuinely misrepresented or you think she was caught and then tried to lie her way out, the fact that she reached for the fake audio defense says something about our current era. We're entering a world where AI-generated voices, deepfakes, and synthetic media are becoming cheaper, faster, and more convincing by the month. That means two things. First, it really is becoming easier to fabricate or manipulate audio and video in ways that can mislead the public. But second, and just as important, it's becoming easier for powerful people to claim that any inconvenient recording is fake, even when it isn't. If every damaging leak can be dismissed as an AI deepfake, even when journalists and experts can verify its authenticity, the result is a kind of information collapse. People stop believing anything at all. The Wiles controversy sits right on that fault line. On one side, you have a senior official saying, these truth bombs aren't real the way you think they are. This is a smear. This is misrepresented, manipulated content. On the other, you have journalists and media outlets saying, we've checked, we verified, we can match these recordings to original material. They are what they appear to be. And viewers, voters, and even foreign observers are left trying to decide who they trust more. It's not just about Susie Wiles. It's about whether facts, evidence, and recorded reality still have the power to cut through partisan narratives. Now, let's zoom back into the domestic political implicate ions, because they're huge. Inside the Republican Party, this story is a Rorschach test. If you're firmly in the Trump camp, you might see Wiles as a loyal lieutenant unfairly targeted by a hostile media ecosystem. To you, Vanity Fair is out to embarrass Trump by weaponizing his own inner circle against him. The more mainstream and liberal-leaning the outlet, the more you're inclined to doubt its motives. On that view, any Republican strategist talking to Vanity Fair at all is suspect. And any hint of criticism, even mild or private, is magnified into disloyalty. If you're in the anti-Trump or more traditional Republican camp, you might read this the opposite way. You might look at Wiles's reported comments as a rare, honest glimpse into what Trump's own people really think, but are usually afraid to say publicly. In that interpretation, the story confirms a long-running pattern. Even those closest to Trump know the chaos is real, know the flaws are serious, and see the risks to American democracy and global stability. They just usually keep it quiet because their careers depend on proximity to power. And if you're outside the Republican ecosystem altogether, if you're a Democrat, an independent, or watching from abroad, you might see this as yet another sign of dysfunction in a movement that already looks unruly and unstable. Whichever angle you choose, the net result is the same. The Trump White House looks messy, divided, more focused on internal drama than on governing. And remember, this is happening not over a policy decision, not over a Supreme Court pick or a war, but over an interview and some audio clips. If this is the level of chaos over a magazine piece, what does it look like when the stakes are decisions about war and peace, about sanctions on Russia or China, about trade deals, or about the future of NATO? That's why foreign intelligence services watch this stuff so closely. Personnel is policy. The people who surround the president, the way they talk about each other, and the lines they're willing to cross in public all give clues about how decisions are made in private. So where does this leave Susie Wiles at the time those articles were written? She was still trying to thread an almost impossible needle. On one hand, she needed to reassure Trump and his base that she was loyal, that she hadn't badmouthed him to a magazine, that she hadn't fed the media storylines about incompetence or chaos. On the OT hand, the more aggressively she denied things that reporters could back up with tape, the more she risked shredding her credibility with those same reporters, with the broader political class, and with anyone in the public still trying to sort fact from spin. In American politics, you can sometimes survive bad headlines. What's much harder to survive is the perception that you lie as easily as you breathe, especially when your job involves running the White House, managing crises, and speaking for the president in private rooms where trust is everything. For viewers like you trying to make sense of all this, the key is not to get lost in the noise. Strip away the personalities, the spin, and the tribal loyalties, and a few core questions remain. Did the chief of staff to the president say things in private that contradict the public message about the administration? If she did, is that simply a sign of realism in an otherwise loyal advisor, or is it evidence of deeper rot and hypocrisy inside the system? When confronted with uncomfortable evidence like recordings, is the first instinct to own the words and explain them, or to try to discredit the evidence entirely? And finally, if this is how the inner circle handles a media story, how are they handling negotiations with adversaries, crises abroad, or pressure from allies? Those are the questions that matter, not just for partisan scorekeeping, but for understanding where the United States is heading and how stable its leadership really is. So as we step back from the day-to-day headlines about Susie Wiles, Vanity Fair, Pam Bondi, J.D. Vance, and truth bombs, here's the big picture. You were watching in real time a struggle over narrative control at the heart of American power. A powerful staffer tried to work with a national magazine and wound up at the center of a storm. A White House built on loy. Alti politics is now dealing with the fallout of private words becoming public. And a media ecosystem that thrives on leaks, scoops, and scandal is tearing into the contradictions. For America's rivals, this is an opportunity. Instability in Washington can be exploited. For America's allies, it's a warning. The partner you rely on might be governed by people too busy fighting each other to govern you reliably. And for American citizens and for anyone around the world who cares about how the U.S. uses its power, it's a reminder that the health of a democracy isn't just about who sits in the big chair. It's also about who whispers in that person's ear, what they say when they think no one's listening, and how they react when those whispers leak into the light. If you found this breakdown useful and you want more deep dives into the stories behind the headlines, especially where domestic political drama intersects with global power, make sure you stick around. Because in a world where even a chief of staff's off-the-record words can shake perceptions of the most powerful office on earth, you can be sure this won't be the last time a hit piece, a leaked tape, or a denied quote has consequences far beyond the front page.